Mima obi bi akwa eba juicy news, hot news all time, latest and hot news. Na mede bremo. Eye Kwesi Pratt, senior journalist, a ɔyɛ inside newspaper editor. Ɛde nsɛm bi ato dwa ɛfa IMF no ɔno so akyɛ no adwene fa na ɔde nsɛm bebree bi ato dwa atoro nsɛm bi a NPP foɔ ka kyerɛ Ghanafoɔ wɔbiebie nneɛma bi so akyerɛ Ghanafoɔ. Na ansa na yɛbɛkɔ ne nsɛm no message sɛ wɔn subscribe ya ɔbɛ subscribe o click subscribe button no na wabɛle notification no woyɛ ne saa any new upload bia no ɔso benya bi ahwɛ afɛ wo na wa like video no wama thumbs up na wa share ama afoforɔ so enya bi ahwɛ afɛ yɛnkɔ Kwesi Pratt nsɛm no mu. Ɛyɛ editor of the inside newspaper ɛyɛ Kwesi Pratt ɔyɛ senior journalist wɔde nsɛm bi ato dwa ɛfa IMF Ghana de ne nsa ɛkɔhyɛ aseɛ no na wakyerɛkyerɛ nsɛm no ebiebie nneɛma bi so akyerɛ Ghanafoɔ na ɔkyerɛ sɛ NPP foɔ ka sɛ wɔne nkɔ IMF na wɔne boa na atorɔ na wɔne di akyerɛ Ghanafoɔ na wɔse ansa na NPP foɔ bɛba abɛm abere a wɔne ewi ne election wɔne ba abɛm na Ghana wɔ IMF da na wɔne baeɛ no wɔne extend IMF program no kɔ 1 year wɔne extend program no kɔ 1 year ɛma conditions na wɔ hɔ wɔne di so ne nyinaa amoa ɛma nneɛma bɛyɛ den. Na wɔne ka sɛ wei ne deɛ di kan a wɔne kɔ IMF deɛ na wɔne boa
juicy news on YouTube.
Na ɛyɛ Kwesi Pratt ɛtoa ne nsɛm so no ɔsɛ IMF no deɛ wokɔ a nsusuanso a ɛwɔ hɔ no ano ɔhyie pa ɔsɛ IMF no deɛ wokɔ a sika deɛ wobɛnya bi ɛna ɔsa ka biribi sɛ policy credibility na ɔsɛ sika no deɛ wobɛnya na saa sika no ɛnyɛ sika a wobɛtumi de bi ayɛ akwan anaasɛ wode provide nsuo ama womanfoɔ na saa sika no yɛde ma wo ma wode sisi ntokura a wakreti wɔ economy nim no ɛka wode tua wo loans saa sika no yɛde ma wo ɛno ɛna wode yɛ besia wo wakɔbɔ no ɛno ɛna wode saa sika no ɛyɛ wode tuatua waka na ɔtoa ne nsɛm so ɔka about policy credibility no ɔkyerɛ sɛ ɛno no ɛde wobɛgyina mpɛmpɛnsoɔ bi asese deɛ wobɔ besia wobɛtumi atua nti international community bɛmu sɛ okay wobɔ besia wobɛtumi atua woka wode no. Na Kwesi Pratt ɛkɔ so ɛma mfato ho bebree ɛfa IMF conditionalities ebi esi ɛbɛ 1982-83 hɔ conditions a IMF fo de maa ne ahokyerɛ ne ahohihia Ghanafoɔ ɛkɔ mu ɔde ne nyinaa ato dwa na mempɛ sɛ mɛka ne nsɛm nyinaa no momma yɛntie Kwesi Pratt sɛ ɔde ne nsɛm ato dwa momma yɛntie Kwesi Pratt.
As of last week, leading members of government were still denying that they would have nothing to do with the IMF. So we would like to know when the informal engagements started. That's number one. Number two, I think it's important for all of us to understand that this government approach would not necessarily result in an IMF bailout. Government is making the approach to the IMF. The IMF will sit with government and examine government's request and enter into negotiations with government on what to do and what not to do and so on. These negotiations can fail. The IMF, on the basis of the facts that government makes available to them, can also decide not to grant the request of government. So those who think that IMF can solve the problem, even those who think that the IMF can solve the problem, it is not Uhuru yet. There's still some distance. We know as a fact that some countries have been negotiating with the IMF for 5 years, still negotiating.
You are watching Juicy News on YouTube.
Years.
Hot news all
Sri
time.
Lanka has been negotiating with the IMF for well over 12 months, and there's no resolution yet. So this statement from the Minister of Information does not mean that we are getting an IMF bailout. And I think it should be clear to everybody. We may or may not get an IMF bailout. Now, if government has come to the point where government thinks that the way out is an IMF bailout, what if we don't get the bailout? This same government only recently had come to the conclusion that the way out was the imposition of the e-levy. It turns out that that didn't work. Now they have another alternative, which is to go to the IMF. The question I'm asking is that what if this doesn't also work? Where would we go? Now, we should be asking ourselves why we are where we are today. Why this government after all the protestations, had decided to go to the IMF for a bailout. Why? What is the situation we are dealing with? Sana, the situation is very, 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 very bad. The economic conditions of Ghana today are so horrible. And I think it's important to demonstrate that in more graphic terms so people can understand. What is the situation? The situation today, and the Ghanaian economic situation today, is that if we got a visiting head of state and he went to Flagstaff House and we want to serve him with a cup of tea, we need to borrow to be able to serve the visiting head of state with a cup of tea. The situation today is such that if the president drives from his Nima residence to the Flagstaff House, the petrol he uses is bought with borrowed money. I hope you are getting the picture. The situation today is that Ghana doesn't have enough money to construct 1 inch of gutter at Abelempe. 1 inch of gutter at Abelempe. The situation today is that if we don't borrow money, we cannot pay civil and public sector workers. It's impossible. The situation today is that this government, our government, the government led by His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, doesn't have any money to do anything. That's where we are.
Watching Juicy
You may
News
think
on
that I'm
YouTube.
exaggerating.
Hot news all time.
Look at the report that the IFS recently released at a press conference. If you look at the report that the IFS recently released at a press conference, what did it say? It said that if you put together all of our revenue, all the money we earn as a nation, if you put all of that together, you need 128% of that to service debt and to pay public sector emoluments. What does that mean? What does that mean? 2 line items: public sector emoluments and debt servicing. So public sector emoluments, to pay public sector emoluments, you need to borrow. 128% of total national revenue is far bigger than total national revenue. So to pay, after servicing debts, to pay public sector emoluments, you need to borrow. And after you have borrowed, 28% of your total national revenue, and added it to your national revenue, nothing is left to do anything. That's how horrible our economic situation is. Okay? Now, Senna, it is not true that this is the first time the NPP government is going to the IMF. This is the second time that the NPP government is going to the IMF. So when they were standing behind microphones and shouting that we will never go to the IMF and so on, they were lying. Sana, when this government assumed power, this country was already in an IMF program. This government decided to extend that program by 1 year. Was that not going to the IMF? When they decided to extend the IMF program by 1 year, we went to the IMF. We accepted conditionalities of the IMF for 1 more year. So it is not true that this is the first time this government is going to the IMF. It is also not true that we are going to the IMF because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine-Russia war. Because when we went for the extension of the IMF program, there was no COVID-19 pandemic. And there was no Ukraine-Russian war. The first time this government went to the IMF, these things did not exist. I hope you understand what I'm saying. Now, we've been to the IMF before. Under President Akufo-Addo, we've been to the IMF before. What happened when we went to the IMF? Nothing. Zilch. We continue going down and down and down until we hit rock bottom. and went below rock bottom. Now we are below rock bottom. So going to the IMF, really, this government has demonstrated that it doesn't solve any problem. They went, they came back, and no problem was solved. The problem got worse. I hope you understand what I'm saying.